and viewers. In today's edition of the Geo-Interview, we are honored to host Dr. Stanley Johny, the International Affairs Editor at the esteemed The Hindu. Dr. Stanley has recently published his second book titled The Comrade and The Mullahs, which is also co-authored by Anand Krishnan. In today's interview, we'll be broadly focusing upon the crucial and the important questions that the book raises and that it seeks to address. Welcome, Dr. Stanley.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's an honor for us, sir. So before we get into the whereabouts, if you could tell us and our viewers about the motivations that led you to write this book.
Yeah, interestingly, there is a backstory to the book. The idea of this book was born on Twitter. So in July 2021, you may know that the Taliban's co-founder Mullah Baradar went to Tianjin to meet the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. So immediately after that, the Chinese Foreign Ministry had released photographs of Wang Yi and Mullah Baradar, together. So that is apparently the cover of the book. It's in Tianjin. So I had tweeted this photo with a caption, "The Comrade and the Mullah." So Swati Chopra, who is the executive editor of HarperCollins, so she responded to this tweet saying that this could be the title of a book. Then Anand Krishnan, who's my colleague, who's also the China correspondent of The Hindu, who's been covering China for the last quite some time. He has also written a wonderful book, India's China Challenge, right? His first book. So Anand Krishnan joined in asking me, why can't we do it, Stanley? So that's how the idea of this book was born. And later on, I recall a conversation I had with Anand, in which Anand was telling me that there is a cracking book, basically understanding China's interest in Afghanistan. Also, Afghanistan has a very complex history. And I mean, as a student of international relations, I've been writing about West Asia and the Islamic world in general for the last quite some time. My first book was on West Asia, or the Middle East, whatever you want to call it, the ISIS Caliphate. So yeah, because Afghanistan, if you look at Afghanistan has a very complex history. It's also called the graveyard of empires. And why it's called so? Because at least in the last 3 centuries, Afghanistan saw great power interventions, right? 19th century, the British went into Afghanistan. 20th century, the Soviets went into Afghanistan. And early 21st century, the Americans went into Afghanistan. So in a way, while the circumstances could be different, but in a way the results were almost similar. In a sense, all great powers had to pull back from Afghanistan without meeting their strategic objectives. The British Empire, the mighty British Empire of 19th century, while the British troops were withdrawing in the mid-19th century, all except one soldier who was apparently a medical professional, everybody was massacred by Akbar Khan's guerrilla fighters. So our book actually starts with the introduction. The opening paragraph is about a painting by Liz Taylor about the last surviving British man who made it to the fort in Ghazni. So the same goes with the Soviets. The Soviets went into Afghanistan. They had their communist regime, their communist president, in the presidential palace, and the Soviets remained in Afghanistan for 10 years, but they had to withdraw in ignominy 10 years later in 1989, which eventually led to the fall of the pro-Soviet regimes. I mean, immediately after immediately after the Soviets were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan, the Soviets started facing setbacks even in their immediate periphery in the Eastern Europe as well, where communist regimes started collapsing. And the Americans were in Afghanistan for 20 years. They brought down the Taliban. They helped establish a new regime, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. 100,000 American soldiers were at the height of the American presence in Afghanistan. And then what happened? 20 years down the line, the Americans also had to withdraw from Afghanistan, practically handing the country over to the Taliban. So there is something interesting in Afghanistan's history, why Afghanistan always resisted great power interventions, and why the great powers always, why great powers got attracted to Afghanistan. And now that the Americans are out and the Chinese are on the gates of Afghanistan, and China is rising as the next major superpower. So, what role China is likely to play in Afghanistan? So, these are the potential questions that intrigued us, me and Anand Krishnan. So, then we, in the book, what we try to do is we have tried to reconstruct Afghanistan's history in the simplest words, in a very few chapters. And then we try to look at Afghanistan from the Chinese point of view. So this is the motivation, and these are the broader ideas of the book.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir. And if I may say, that's a very interesting name for the book indeed, because when I saw the title, I was very intrigued. And I believe it's much more realistic in nature because for whatever the world or the Western world would like to call the Taliban or ragtag militia or Islamist terrorist organizations, essentially they call themselves mullahs. And for you to include that in the title, that's a very realistic perspective. And it's quite fascinating how the so-called ragtag militia has destroyed some of the greatest empires the world had ever seen, be it USSR or be it now USA. So my next question would follow as, in your opinion, what are likely to be the major implications of this takeover of Kabul, the way it was done, strictly from the Asian perspective? For instance, when Taliban took over Kabul again, Pakistan saw it as a major geopolitical win, and like even the highest officials of Pakistan, they came on Twitter and they sort of made it very clear how Pakistan has now gained the strategic or geostrategic depth that they've always seen. And there were also fears in the Indian echelons of power that Taliban coming to Kabul will now raise a lot of security issues for us in Kashmir, and how China will play out. So, what do you think about this from the Asian perspective?
Yeah, if you look at it from India's point of view, the developments in Afghanistan in August 2021 is actually a tactical setback for Indian interests. Why? Because ever since the Taliban were brought down in 2001 after the American invasion of Afghanistan, India has stepped up its engagement with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. India has invested, let's say, $3 billion in Afghanistan, developed very close ties with Afghanistan's new rulers, and the peoples to people contacts as well, improved a great deal. And you look at India's engagement with Afghanistan from a historical point of view. India has always decided to deal with the regime in Afghanistan, the government of the day in Afghanistan, except in the 1990s when the Taliban were in power, from 1995 to 2001, except this brief period. India's policy has always been driven by pragmatic realism, where it decided to engage with the government of the day because you had the monarchy. When India became independent until 1970s, Afghanistan was a monarchy, and then you had Dawood Khan's republic. After that, you had a communist coup, and then the Soviets were in Afghanistan. So you had this communist regime, and then the Mujahideen came to power. So throughout this period, including with the Mujahideen government, India retained the terms of the engagement, bilateral relationship, etc., etc. But this policy changed only when the Taliban were in power. Why? Because the Taliban's capture of power in Kabul posed a security challenge to India, and Kashmir violence was going up at that time. And secondly, India saw the Taliban as a Pakistani proxy, and the Taliban taking power in Afghanistan would offer some kind of strategic depth to Pakistan, which India saw would be a setback to Indian interests. And we also know the story about the hijacking of the Indian airplane, which landed in Kandahar, and the role the Taliban played, etc., etc. So India had legitimate concerns about the Taliban. So what India did in the 1990s was to support the anti-Taliban forces, namely the Northern Alliance. So India was coordinating with the Russians, the Iranians, the Central Asian republics, etc., etc. So this was the policy in the 1990s. So now, after staying invested in Afghanistan for 20 years, after investing billions of dollars in Afghanistan, after developing very deep ties and contacts with the people of Afghanistan, India saw, I mean, the Taliban returning to power again. And again, this time the Taliban were directly supported by the Pakistanis, and the Americans were out of Afghanistan, right? So this actually posed some kind of challenges, tactical challenges to India, which I think is a fact. And India also knew this. But if you compare it with the 1990s, India has taken a different approach this time, because the Taliban on the one side appeared to be stronger inside Afghanistan, and the regional dynamics have changed if you look at the Asian dynamics. Because in the 1990s, India was coordinating, as I said, with Russia, Iran, and Central Asian republics in propping up the Northern Alliance that was fighting the Taliban in the Afghan civil war. But now, there is no Northern Alliance. There is a rump of guerrilla army in Panjshir, but they are nowhere, to the size of, to the influence which Ahmad Shah Massoud wielded in Panjshir Valley in the 1990s. And secondly, you take a look at Russia, look at Iran, which almost went to a war with Afghanistan, Taliban in the 1990s, had established contacts, at least terms of engagement with the Taliban. The Russians are also ready to at least engage with the Taliban. So the regional dynamics have changed. The internal dynamics have changed. So Indian approach has also evolved, because in the 1990s, if India had taken a completely hostile line towards the Taliban, in 2022, you can see the government of Narendra Modi sending a diplomatic delegation to Kabul to meet with the leadership of the Taliban. So this is, the Indian approach was actually, India was forced to take a different approach because the regional and internal dynamics have changed. And when it comes to Pakistan, so at this point of time, I think the Pakistani assessment is that, as you rightly pointed out, the Pakistani assessment is that Pakistan has got some strategic depth, because the Taliban in the last 20 years were completely dependent on Pakistan. It was Pakistan that helped the Taliban regroup in Quetta and then stage counterattacks inside Afghanistan. And ISI was, there is the Directorate S, ISI's department was propping up the Taliban and helping it take back the territories in Afghanistan, which eventually led to the Taliban's takeover of the whole country. But at the same time, there are fault lines in Pakistan's ties with the Taliban as well, because the Taliban themselves are a very complex organization. You have the Afghan Taliban, which are now power in Afghanistan, and you have Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or the Pakistani Taliban, which are predominantly based in Pakistan and fighting the Pakistani establishment. The Afghan Taliban established Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan twice, not once, twice, in the 1990s and now. And what the Pakistani Taliban want to do is to do the same. They want to turn Pakistan into an Islamic Emirate, right? Because the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban are practically ideological brothers. There could be organizational differences, but they are ideological brothers. They want to do the same thing. But Pakistan, which is backing the Afghan Taliban because of its strategic interests, is fighting the Pakistani Taliban because the Pakistani Taliban is posing a direct security threat to Pakistan's establishment. So even Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban as a whole is very complicated. So at this point of time, yeah, Pakistan may be thinking that they have got strategic depth. But my assessment is that it would get only more complicated going forward. Because once the Taliban mobilizes or stabilizes its, if at all, stabilizes its governance in within Afghanistan, it would not like to be reliant on the Pakistani establishment forever. No nationalist force would like to do that, right? So there are fault lines as well.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. And sir, since you mentioned a lot of Indian imperatives and the things that concerns India's national security, I want to put this question to you that despite the stint that Indian government had with the first phase of Taliban, and this time the Taliban seems to be much more realpolitik in nature, unlike the last time wherein they were largely bound by their ideological confines. This time they're not. And there has been a significant line of communication between India and the new republic or the new government of Taliban. But do you think so? China will allow India and Afghanistan or Taliban to foster deeper relationships with each other, or how does China see India and Afghanistan together?
Yeah. So let's first look at it from the Taliban's point of view. There was a lot of discussion about whether the Taliban have changed, the Taliban 2.0 have changed from the 1990s Taliban. So if you ask me, ideologically or organizationally or in terms of governance, the Taliban haven't changed much in the last 20 years. So the new regime of the Taliban, they are also imposing the same kind of restrictions which the old one did. The secondary school for women haven't been opened yet. There are restrictions on women traveling alone. And the government in Afghanistan is pretty much the Pashtun, men only, predominantly Pashtun, men only government. So, and its ideology also hasn't undergone any major changes. But at the same time, the Taliban's foreign policy, its relationship with the outside world has changed. That's because my assessment is that the Taliban have realized that it's not its internal repression of the people of Afghanistan that led to the Taliban's collapse in 2001. It is the Taliban's decision to host Al-Qaeda, the Taliban's decision to host Osama bin Laden, who orchestrated the terrorist attack, which drew in the Americans into Afghanistan and eventually leading to the fall of the Taliban's regime in Afghanistan, right? So it is not the domestic policies, it is not the domestic repression, but it is the foreign policy of the Taliban that led to the Taliban's fall in 2001. The Taliban have realized it. So this time what the Taliban have done is that they haven't changed much domestically. But in terms of its foreign policy, the Taliban have reached out to the world. It reached out to the Chinese, it reached out to the Russians, it met even the Iranians. It is receptive to even India's outreach, because the Taliban selling point is that back in 2001, back in the late 1990s, the Taliban were blamed by all regional countries for hosting militant organizations. The anti-India organizations like Lashkar-e-Taiba, etc., and the ETIM, which is the Uyghur militant group of China, and the Uzbek Islamist groups. So the Taliban were hosting. The Taliban run Afghanistan became a safe haven for all these regional militant organizations, militant or terrorist organizations back in the 1990s. So this time the Taliban's selling point is that we have cut ties with all these groups. We are not going to host terrorist organizations anymore. What we want is better ties, better government to government, country to country ties with all the regional players. So this is the Taliban's selling point. And the Taliban are also telling India, China, Russia, and other countries that Afghanistan still has terrorists. Like Afghanistan has the Islamic State Khorasan, right? Afghanistan has other militant organizations. And these organizations would pose a challenge to you. And to deal with the organizations, you will have to deal with the government of the Afghanistan. And we are the government of the Afghanistan. So what the Taliban are plainly doing is that the Taliban want to have relationship with regional countries. The Taliban want international legitimacy. And the Taliban want to achieve these goals without making any meaningful changes in its domestic governance. That's what the Taliban want. So as part of that, the Taliban is reaching out to these countries. So what India's interest is, you look at India's interest now, look at the whole scenario from an Indian point of view. So Indians have invested, as I said, billions of dollars in Afghanistan. India want to protect these interests, its investments. Secondly, India would not like Afghanistan to be a safe haven for anti-India terrorist groups, like what happened in the 1990s. So how do you achieve this? For that, you have to, at the end of the day, you have to engage with whoever the ruler of Afghanistan is, right? And thirdly, India should, of course, in a broader strategic point of view, India should also explore the possibility of the Taliban's autonomy from Pakistan. because it would not be in India's interest for the Taliban to remain permanently reliant and dependent on the Pakistani security establishment. So these are India's broad strategic goals in Afghanistan, and to pursue these goals, you will have to engage the Taliban. I think this realistic assessment is what driving India's policy towards the Taliban. And from the Chinese point of view, again, if how the Chinese look at Afghanistan. First of all, like India, China also doesn't want Afghanistan to be, or at least to the border, the Chinese-Afghan border, to be a safe haven for ETIM. And secondly, the groups like Islamic State Khorasan, gaining more ground in Afghanistan poses threat to regional security architecture. And then thirdly, China, as part of its BRI and other investment initiative, there are thousands of Chinese nationals across Central Asia and Pakistan, etc., etc. So China doesn't want any kind of security threats to its nationals operating in Central Asia and South Asia as part of its investment proposals, its investment initiatives. So China also wants security, and China would also like to explore the possibility of making investments in Afghanistan, tapping its natural resources, because Afghanistan has huge natural resources in terms of gold, copper, oil, lithium, rare earth minerals, etc., etc., right? So these are the Chinese interests. So my point is that here, all three actors, be it the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, India, or Afghanistan or China, they all are driven by their own interests. So at this point of time, I think it is in Taliban's interest to have better ties with as many regional powers as possible. And the regional powers also, driven by their own limited interests, also would like to establish some kind of engagements with the Taliban. So what you see right now, it's too early for India or China to offer official recognition, diplomatic recognition to the Taliban regime. It's still in the very, very early stages. But at the same time, you can see that the stage is set. Because unlike in the 1990s, the regional powers this time are more inclined towards engaging the Taliban rather than, teaming up against the regime in Afghanistan. So that's what we are witnessing right now.
Thank you, sir. Sir, since you mentioned this very important fact, and because it's the Indian national interest that concerns us primarily, I have to put forward this question that, as you rightly mentioned, that Taliban is not a very homogeneous organization, and even though now they realize that they need to cut ties with almost all of the other terrorist organizations that threaten regional instability or stability. So do you think that because in Afghanistan or in Taliban there are some very anti-Indian elements which forms the core of the Taliban, the ones who have control over Kabul? So do you think that Taliban as an organization will be willing to not support terrorist organizations that are anti-Indian in nature, given that some of the core of the Taliban happens to be very Pakistan dependent and very anti-Indian in their nature?
Yeah, it's a very complex situation because the Taliban are not a monolithic organization. And within the Taliban framework, there is a Haqqani network. And the Haqqanis have very deep ties with the Pakistani security establishment. That's true. Pakistan would always have some amount of influence over the Taliban, which would definitely be the case. But at the same time, my point is that, for the Taliban, it is almost existential to at least convince the world that it has cut ties with these terrorist organizations. Whether they would actually completely 100% cut off ties is a different question. But it at least has to convince the world that it has, or at least it's no longer hosting them. It's no longer hosting organizations that are fundamentally against the security interests of the regional powers. Because the Taliban still haven't got international recognition. In the 1990s, at least 3 countries had recognized them: Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the UAE. This time, no country has recognized the Taliban, including Pakistan hasn't offered official recognition. So there is some amount of international pressure on the one side. And the Taliban is very keen to get international recognition because the Taliban know that it needs financial support. If it's not, its reserves are frozen by the Americans. If it's not from the international community, it at least needs financial support from regional powers. And then secondly, it wants official recognition. So at least since the Doha Agreement was signed in 2020 February, the Taliban's approach is that, that it would cut ties with these organizations, these militant organizations. So this whole Taliban approach has been institutionalized by the Doha Agreement. Because in the Doha Agreement, the Taliban said that we will sever ties with the Islamic State, we will sever ties with Al Qaeda, and we will fight the Islamic State. So the Americans said, okay, fine, thank you very much. We are then leaving. Okay, right? That's what happened in Doha Agreement. So the whole Taliban approach has been institutionalized by the Doha Agreement between the Trump administration and the Taliban. So this has also become the major selling point of the Taliban. So yeah, it's true that the Taliban have a very complex structure. It has multiple factions within. But at the same time, I think for the Taliban's own survival, because this time the Taliban are in Kabul for a longer run. They haven't captured Kabul to rule Afghanistan for 5 years like last time, because the Taliban realized that Emirates and Islamic republics or Islamic regimes have survived longer period. You look at Saudi Arabia, you look at the Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia at its inception was much more brutal, right? When Saudi Arabia was founded in the 1930s or during the conflict in the 1920s. So the Taliban realized that they can also have a longer run if they become a little more pragmatic, at least in its foreign policy, without making any fundamental changes on its domestic policy. So I think that is what the overwhelming policy approach of the Taliban. So to achieve this goal of survival, the Taliban would be ready to cut deals with the regional powers on promises that it would take action against regional militant or terrorist organizations. That's what my assessment is.
Thank you so much, sir. Sir, this is going to be one of the last questions that I have to put forward to you. Sir, energy security is one of the most important themes of the 21st century. We see it in Indo-Pacific, and there are countless instances, even in the book, wherein you have mentioned how much China values energy security and how it formulates one of the very core motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative. Sir, in that context, how much do you think the West is accountable for in the sense that to secure Ukraine, don't you think they have fostered deeper ties between Russia and China, which helps China not only secure the essential natural resources that it needs, but now we also see that Chinese people or the Chinese corporations are moving into and they're putting a lot of investments into Siberian hinterlands. And following that question, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, the world has seen how important our energy is to the 21st century. And given that, so Germany, what now Germany is doing is that now Germany is shutting down its nuclear power plants, and now it's reverting back to coal. And given that it forms the core of the G20 and it's such a developed country, don't you think the world should end, or the developed countries should join hands and they should end this anti-nuclear wave that is raging across the West? Because if we revert ourselves back to the natural resources, we're going to be dependent upon Russia, and that will further embolden China, which at the end defeats the longer game of the West or America in general.
That's true. In a sense, if you look at the whole American Chinese contest, which most scholars call the most important geopolitical contest of the 21st century. You look at it realistically, what the United States should do. The United States should focus its resources on China, right? Instead, what the United States is doing is focusing its resources on Russia. So this, this is what Ambassador Shivshankar Menon says, that he says to his mind, it looks like the United States is more comfortable with Russia as an enemy or as a rival than China, which is the actual rival. China is already the world's second largest economy, you know, and during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, at no point during the Cold War the Soviet Union had attained the kind of economic resources, the economic power which China has now. China has under its command now. At no point during the Cold War, you know. So China is set to become the world's largest economy within a matter of time. China has already established the world's largest navy. China is the world's second largest military superpower. And it's very clear that China is the country, and what Rush Doshi has written a book, no, a long game, which he calls China's effort to upstage the United States as the world's most important superpower. You know, to displace the superpower, what he calls displacing the superpower. So China has a grand strategy according to Doshi's analysis. So whatever that grand strategy is, my point is that it is plain to any student of IR that the most important geopolitical contest of the 21st century is between these two countries. But that's not what is happening. Actually, you know, the United States, the focus on Russia, or even the developments that eventually led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent economic warfare, which to my view is that practically, on the ground, it's not defeating the Russians. The Russians keep gaining territories. I've been saying this from day one, despite contradictory reports in media. Russians keep gaining territories in Ukraine. And then secondly, the economic punishments on Russia, they are weakening the whole world, not just Russia, including the West and the other countries in the East. And then thirdly, it's driving Russia further into the Chinese embrace, which is strengthening the Russia-China entente, right? And this could eventually weaken the existing global order. So, but somehow this is not, I mean, this realistic assumptions analysis are not driving Western policymakers in this case. So this is a very complex situation, because they are also, the Western policymakers are also, I think, their options are also limited by the structural challenges they face. Because once the war began, how are you going to, stop the war? If you remove now all the sanctions, it would be called appeasement, or it would be called, once you started a maximalist approach, and you can't just withdraw those, your policies. If you lift the sanctions for the sake of the global economy, everybody would say that the Western approach failed. So this is now a very complicated situation. The Russians have already launched the war, and the West has already taken a very maximalist approach to weaken Russia, according to American, their own policy makers were saying that they want to weaken Russia. That's their goal. So while these maximalist approaches are playing out on the one side, in the larger global spectrum, if you look at it, the pressure China faced during the last American administration is off, right? So the entire West is now focused on Russia. So the entire West, the Americans, basically, particularly the Americans, when they got stuck in the Middle East and other regions, China was rising steadily. So now again, the West is focused on Russia, the pressure is off China. And the conflict and the Western responses towards the conflict, the subsequent responses towards the conflict, is actually driving Russia into the Chinese embrace. So what we see is, it is a lot of realignments are already happening in the world. And I can certainly say that this is not, in the long run, I don't think that the conflict which is now going on is going to help or going to serve the Western interest in the long run, when you look at the most important geopolitical contest of the 21st century.
Thank you so much, sir. And if I may say, it's been an absolute honor for us to host you and to listen to your views. Thank you so much for agreeing for the interview. But sir, before we wrap up the interview, I have this one last question that doesn't concern the book per se, but since you've been in this field of international affairs, journalism, foreign policy for such a long time, what has been your personal experience, and what sort of advice would you have for members at Geostrata and our audience? Because it's our personal observation that people now are getting more and more interested in India's foreign policy and international relations. So, what has been your experience? And if you could give us some advices, that would be great.
Yeah, I consider myself as a student of IR. So this is it's a long run, and we would remain students of IR. It's a very interesting field because the learning process never ends. The world is huge, and there are multiple dimensions to IR. You can learn the theory, and you should also understand history. You should also update yourself with the contemporary developments. So, to my view, the theoretical framework as well as the historical background are very important. And you should also have a sense of the map, because as we say, geography is your destiny. You can't change that, right? And every country, there could be some amount of continuity in their foreign policy because you formulate your foreign policy, that factors in some basic realities, which includes your geography. So that's what geopolitics is all about. So there are different layers, multiple elements in IR. So you can have your own approach towards it, but be inquisitive, keep learning, go back into history, because when Russia attacks Ukraine, you should also look at what the Russians were doing in the 19th century, in the 18th century. Why Catherine the Great? When President Putin took Crimea, you should ask yourself, why did he take Crimea? Then you might also find in history that Catherine the Great had also taken Crimea in 18th century. So there are interesting similarities. There is interesting connectivity, from the past to the present. So I think the historical framework, the historical context, and the theoretical framework are very important in understanding IR, to my sense.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so very much.